A luxury jewelry boutique is supposed to be a place where every guest is treated as though they might be the most important person to walk through the door that day. But for one boutique manager, that courtesy only ever extended to people who looked a certain way before they'd said a single word. A woman in a plain grey coat and flat boots walks into the city's most exclusive jewelry boutique and asks to see the flagship diamond necklace displayed in the center window. He looks her over once, smiles thinly, and tells her that particular piece is reserved for serious collectors, gesturing instead toward a case of considerably smaller, considerably less expensive pieces near the entrance. What he doesn't know is that the woman he just quietly dismissed had signed the papers only 3 days earlier, making her the majority owner of the entire luxury group that owned his boutique, along with 11 others across 4 countries. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from today, and subscribe, because next week's story is one you don't want to miss. Now, let's get into it. Maison Verrier had occupied the same address on the city's most exclusive shopping avenue for almost 70 years, a narrow, elegant storefront of black lacquered wood and gold lettering so understated that most tourists walked past it without a second glance, which was, of course, precisely the point. Inside, the boutique operated less like a retail store and more like a private vault that occasionally allowed visitors, its interior hushed, its lighting deliberately dim and flattering, every piece displayed as though it were on loan from a museum rather than available, however theoretically, for purchase. The boutique's centerpiece, displayed in a single illuminated case at the very center of the front window, was a diamond and platinum necklace known internally as the Verrier Solitaire, a piece so significant to the house's reputation that it had, over the decades, been loaned to 3 different film premieres and once, memorably, worn by a head of state's spouse at an international summit. The Solitaire was not simply for sale. It was, in the words of the boutique's longtime manager, a statement about who Maison Verrier serves, and he had appointed himself, over his 18 years managing the location, the sole and final arbiter of exactly who that statement applied to. That manager was a man named Etienne Roquefort, though everyone in the industry, staff and competitors alike, simply called him Etienne, spoken with the particular reverence reserved for people who had made themselves genuinely difficult to replace. Etienne had built his reputation on an instinct he described, when asked, as reading provenance, a phrase that sounded considerably more sophisticated than what it actually meant in practice, identifying, within seconds of someone entering his boutique, whether their coat, their bag, their watch, and the particular unhurried confidence or nervous uncertainty in how they carried themselves suggested they belonged in conversation about a piece that began, at minimum, in the high 6 figures. At 2 in the afternoon on a quiet Wednesday, a woman walked through Maison Verrier's discreet entrance wearing a plain grey wool coat, dark trousers, and simple flat leather boots, her hair pulled back neatly, carrying nothing but a slim structured handbag and a folded newspaper tucked beneath one arm. She paused briefly near the entrance, taking in the boutique's hushed, dim elegance, before walking directly toward the center window display. "Good afternoon," she said, approaching the nearest sales associate, though it was Etienne himself who moved to intercept her, his instinct for exactly this kind of moment finely tuned after 18 years on the floor. "I'd like to see the Solitaire, please. The necklace in the center window." Etienne approached with a practiced, gracious smile, his eyes moving briefly over the plain coat, the flat boots, the absence of any visible jewelry beyond a thin, unremarkable watch at her wrist. His expression settled into the smooth, faintly patronizing warmth he reserved for moments exactly like this one. "Of course, madam, welcome to Maison Verrier," he said, his accent carrying the specific, cultivated formality of someone who had spent decades perfecting it. "Before I have my colleague retrieve that particular piece, may I ask what brings you in today? Perhaps I can point you toward something that might suit your occasion a bit more, well, more precisely." The woman, whose name was Beatrix Solano, tilted her head slightly, her expression calm and unreadable. I'd like to see the solitaire specifically. I understand the appeal completely, Etienne said, his tone carrying a gentle, cultivated patience. But I do want to be transparent with you, because I think honesty saves everyone an uncomfortable moment. The solitaire is a piece we typically reserve for our most established collectors, clients with whom the house has built a relationship over many years, often decades. I have a truly beautiful selection of pieces near the entrance that I think might genuinely suit you better, wonderful craftsmanship, considerably more, shall we say, accessible. Beatrix's expression didn't shift. I appreciate the suggestion, but I'd specifically like to see the solitaire. Etienne let out a short, elegant laugh, warm on its surface, faintly condescending beneath it. I respect the enthusiasm, truly, but between us, madam, this particular piece begins at just under 3 million, and honestly, for a first visit to the house, most of our new clients find our secondary collection offers a far more comfortable entry point into what Maison Verrier represents. I'd hate for your first experience here to feel, how shall I put this, overwhelming, or for the conversation about financing or provenance verification to feel like an unnecessary hurdle if the numbers don't quite align with today's visit. Two other clients browsing a nearby case, an elegantly dressed older couple, had paused their conversation, glancing over with the specific, curious attention people give to even the mildest friction unfolding in an otherwise silent, reverent room. I don't think financing will be necessary, Beatrix said, her voice still even. I'd like to see the piece, and if I decide to purchase it, I'll pay in full. Etienne's smile thinned slightly, though it didn't disappear entirely. Madam, I do want to gently manage expectations here. A cash purchase at this level requires documentation we would need to verify before I could authorize bringing the solitaire out of its case, purely for insurance and provenance reasons. I promise this isn't personal in any way. It is simply how we protect a piece of this singular importance. Then perhaps you could verify the documentation, Beatrix said. I have it here. She reached into her handbag and produced a slim folder, though she made no immediate move to open it fully. Etienne's eyes flicked briefly toward the back office before settling on her again. I appreciate that, genuinely. But I've been managing this boutique for 18 years, and I've learned it is usually kinder to be direct early, rather than let a client go through an extended process only to discover the fit isn't quite right. There is a wonderful boutique just 2 streets over, excellent selection, considerably more approachable in terms of both price and, forgive me, presentation. I would be glad to call ahead for you personally. It was at this exact moment that a man in a charcoal-tailored suit, moving briskly from the direction of the boutique's private consultation room, crossed the elegant showroom floor, a tablet tucked under one arm and an expression of controlled urgency on his face. Beatrix, he said, slightly breathless, apologies. The final signature on the parent holding transfer took considerably longer than expected with counsel in Geneva, but it is fully closed and recorded as of this morning. He stopped, taking in the scene, Etienne standing near the center case with his hand resting protectively against its glass, Beatrix with her folder still unopened, no piece anywhere in sight on the counter between them. Is everything all right? The man asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked between Etienne and Beatrix. Etienne glanced at him, maintaining his composure with visible, practiced effort. This does not concern you, monsieur. I am simply guiding this client toward pieces more suited to her visit today. The man's eyebrows rose sharply. I'm sorry, what exactly have you been telling her? I have been explaining, Etienne said, with the patience of someone stating something entirely obvious, that the solitaire is reserved for our most established collectors, and that I have suggested some more approachable alternatives given what appears to be a first visit to the house. The man looked at Beatrix, something between disbelief and barely restrained frustration crossing his face, then turned back to Etienne. Do you have any idea who you are currently speaking to? Etienne allowed himself a short, elegant laugh. I know precisely who I am speaking to. A prospective client whose presentation, based on this conversation, does not suggest readiness for a peace at this particular level. Miss Solano's holding company, the man said, his voice dropping into something quiet and precise, completed a transaction 3 days ago acquiring majority control of Chateaubriand Luxury Group. Which, in case that name means nothing to you, happens to be the parent company that owns Maison Verrier, along with 11 other houses across 4 countries. Every piece in this case. Every gram of platinum in that vault downstairs. Your entire compensation package, monsieur. The words landed in the hushed, reverent showroom with the specific, physical weight of a dropped glass. The elegant older couple near the nearby case had gone entirely still, the woman lowering the bracelet she'd been examining slowly back onto its velvet tray, as though afraid the sound might draw unwanted attention. Etienne's hand, which had been resting confidently against the glass of the center case, went rigid. That is not possible, he stammered, his cultivated accent momentarily slipping. Any ownership change at the parent level would have been communicated to boutique management immediately. I would have received a personal briefing. I have relationships with the ownership family going back nearly 2 decades. The transaction closed privately 3 days ago, the man said. The formal announcement to all 12 boutique managers is scheduled for next week's regional meeting in Geneva. Miss Solano asked specifically to visit this location unannounced today, before any internal notice went out, because she wanted to understand exactly how the floor treats prospective clients who walk in without the specific signals your staff has apparently been trained, over many years, to look for. Beatrix had not moved from where she stood, had not raised her voice once through any of this. She looked at Etienne now, her expression calm, unreadable. You can stop managing my expectations now, Etienne. The use of his first name, spoken so calmly by a woman he'd never formally introduced himself to, seemed to land with particular weight. Miss Solano, Etienne said, his voice suddenly small, his cultivated formality entirely drained away. I had absolutely no idea. If I had known who you were, I would never have suggested. You would never have suggested the boutique 2 streets over, Beatrix finished for him, quietly. You said that already, along with the secondary collection, and the concern about my documentation, all within the span of about 6 minutes, before I had said more than perhaps 20 words to you. Etienne's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The man in the charcoal suit, whose name was Raphael Ibarra, Beatrix's chief of staff, had already begun typing quietly into his tablet, his expression the focused calm of someone documenting exactly what he was witnessing. I think, Raphael said, not looking up, we should speak with whoever is currently serving as regional director for this market. Today, if at all possible. I am the senior manager on the floor this afternoon, Etienne said, his earlier composure entirely drained away. Our regional director, Madame Chastain, she is traveling between our Milan and Zurich locations until Friday. Then we'll need her direct line, Raphael said, still typing. And I'll need the names of everyone on staff today who witnessed this conversation, for the record. At this, the elegant older woman near the nearby case stepped forward slightly, her husband following a step behind her. I'll offer a statement, if it would help, she said, her voice carrying an edge of genuine discomfort. My husband and I have been clients of this house for nearly 25 years. I heard almost this entire exchange. She asked to see a piece, quite simply, and was met with excuse after excuse before she had even removed her coat. I have honestly never witnessed anything quite like it in all our years coming here. Etienne flinched visibly, his gaze dropping to the glass case beneath his still trembling hand. Beatrix raised a hand slightly, a small, quiet gesture of acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said to the woman. "That is genuinely appreciated, though it may not be necessary just yet." She turned back to Etienne, who was now gripping the edge of the display case as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Monsieur Roquefort," Beatrix said, her voice still even, carrying none of the condescension he had aimed at her only minutes before, "I want to be very clear about something, because I do not think you fully understand what just happened here. This was never truly about the solitaire. I do not need a diamond necklace to feel secure in who I am. I own the mines the platinum in that case came from, several times over, through various holdings. This is about the fact that in the 6 minutes it took for this conversation to unfold, you decided, based entirely on my coat and my boots, that I did not belong in a room that, as it happens, I now hold majority control of, and I have to wonder, genuinely, how many other women have stood exactly where I am standing now, over your 18 years here, and been quietly, elegantly, condescendingly redirected toward a lesser case, simply because they did not look, in that first glance, like the kind of client you had decided the solitaire was reserved for." Etienne said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would not make things considerably worse. "Raphael," Beatrix said, turning to her chief of staff, "please have someone pull the client interaction logs and any staff notes for this location going back 5 years. I want every documented instance where a client requesting to view one of our flagship pieces was redirected toward a lower tier selection before their request was properly processed, cross-referenced against whatever notes staff may have left regarding the client's appearance, demeanor, or, as Monsieur Roquefort put it, their readiness." "Already requesting it," Raphael said, his fingers still moving steadily across the tablet. Etienne's hands had begun to tremble more visibly against the polished glass. "Miss Solano, I have managed this boutique for 18 years. I built this location's entire reputation for exclusivity almost single-handedly, through relationships I have cultivated with genuine care across 2 decades. This was one interaction. I can explain the context, the specific pressures of protecting a piece of this significance, they." "You can," Beatrix said, not unkindly, but without warmth either. "To whoever ends up formally reviewing this incident, and likely to Madame Chastain directly once she returns from Zurich. I would think carefully about what you say, because Raphael has already documented this entire conversation from the moment he walked in, and at least one long-time client just offered to corroborate it independently." The boutique had settled into an uneasy, hushed quiet now, the earlier reverent murmur replaced by something considerably more tense. A young sales associate, who had been quietly restocking a nearby case, had gone entirely still, watching the unfolding scene with wide, cautious eyes. "Am I being terminated today?" Etienne asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is not my decision to make in this exact moment," Beatrix said. "I do not handle day-to-day personnel matters directly, and I have no intention of making a spectacle of this in the middle of a business afternoon. That is what Madame Chastain and the group's Human Resources Office are for. But I will be speaking with both of them this week, and I will share my own account of exactly what I witnessed and exactly what you said to me across the last several minutes. What happens after that will be a decision they will have to make, with complete information in front of them." She paused, then added, "Though I will say this honestly, if the pattern Raphael finds in those interaction logs resembles what I just experienced today, I do not imagine this will be a particularly difficult decision for anyone involved. Beatrix was shown the solitaire, quietly and without further incident, several minutes later, by the young associate who had witnessed the entire exchange and now handled the piece with visibly careful, deliberate professionalism, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it from its case. Beatrix examined it for a long moment beneath the boutique's soft lighting, then, after a brief, thoughtful pause, declined to purchase it that day, thanking the associate warmly and leaving the boutique with the same quiet, unhurried composure with which she had entered it. 5 days later, in a glass-walled conference room adjacent to Chateaubriand Luxury Group's regional offices, Regional Director Margot Chastain sat across from Beatrix Solano and Rafael Ibarra, her expression tight with barely controlled anxiety, a tablet open in front of her displaying 5 years of client interaction logs that Rafael's team had compiled across all 12 boutique locations over the preceding week. "Miss Solano," Margot began, her voice carrying the particular formal precision of someone choosing every word with considerable care, "I want to begin by saying I am genuinely troubled by what I have reviewed since returning early from Zurich. I had no formal awareness that this kind of preemptive screening, was occurring with this level of consistency at our flagship location." "I believe you did not have formal awareness," Beatrix said evenly. "I am considerably less certain there was not an informal culture that quietly encouraged it, particularly given how long Monsieur Roquefort has been permitted to operate with essentially unchecked discretion." Margot exhaled slowly, the sound heavy in the quiet room. "The logs Raphael's team pulled, I have spent the better part of the last 4 days reviewing them personally, alongside our head of client relations. There is a pattern I genuinely cannot responsibly explain away or attribute to isolated incidents. 31 documented instances over 5 years where clients requesting to view one of our 3 flagship pieces across this location were redirected toward secondary collections before their request was ever formally processed. 24 of those 31 instances involved staff notes, the overwhelming majority written by Etienne personally, describing the client's attire, ethnicity, age, or, in several particularly troubling cases, notes that explicitly questioned whether the client's presentation was, and I am reading directly from his own documentation, consistent with the house's typical clientele. And Etienne Roquefort's name, Beatrix said, appears on how many of those 31 instances specifically?" Margot exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping briefly to the tablet before returning to Beatrix. 26. The room sat in heavy, prolonged silence for a long moment, the weight of the number settling visibly over all 3 of them. "I want a full, independent audit of client interaction practices across all 12 boutiques in the group," Beatrix said, turning to Raphael. "Not simply this location. If a pattern this consistent existed here, under one manager's judgment, largely unchecked for 18 years, I want to understand whether it exists more broadly across our other markets, quietly, in ways that have simply never generated a complaint loud enough to reach regional or corporate leadership. I will have the audit team engaged across all 12 locations by the end of next week," Raphael said, already making detailed notes on his tablet. "And Monsieur Roquefort?" Margot asked carefully, her voice noticeably quieter now. Beatrix considered this for a long moment, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to Margot. "I am not interested in ending someone's career over a single conversation, even one as elegantly condescending as the one I sat through this week. But 26 instances over 5 years, all following an almost identical pattern, is not a single conversation. That is an established practice this boutique has apparently tolerated, and in some sense quietly celebrated as evidence of its exclusivity, because it never generated a formal complaint loud enough to force a genuine reckoning, until now." "So termination," Margot said quietly, the word carrying obvious, considerable weight in the formal room. That is a decision within your authority as regional director, based on the group's own personnel policies and the evidence now in front of you, Beatrix said. But I will be honest with you, Margot, if he remains on staff in any capacity after this review, I will want an extremely clear understanding of what genuine accountability looks like beyond a documented warning, because documented warnings clearly did nothing to interrupt this pattern after instance 1, or instance 12, or instance 26. Margot nodded slowly, making a careful, deliberate note. There is one additional matter I should mention, she said, hesitating slightly. Word of the incident has already begun circulating quietly among staff across our other boutique locations, and I understand at least one of the clients present that day has mentioned it within her own social circle, which includes several individuals connected to luxury and lifestyle journalism. There is already some quiet attention building around this, the kind of situation that tends to find its way into industry publications if it is not handled with considerable care. Beatrix's expression did not change. That is not something I orchestrated, and it is not something I am particularly troubled by. If people within this industry are genuinely discussing how clients actually get treated at houses like ours, that is a conversation I would sincerely rather see happen honestly and in the open, rather than continue quietly, unresolved, in staff notes that sit unreviewed in a filing system for nearly 2 decades at a time. The following 2 weeks unfolded with the particular, careful intensity of a crisis being managed thoroughly rather than hastily. Raphael's audit team, working methodically across all 12 Chateaubriand boutiques spanning 4 countries, uncovered patterns that varied considerably in severity but remarkably little in kind. At the group's Milan flagship, a nearly identical pattern emerged around its own signature emerald collection, though involving a different senior associate whose documented instances, while somewhat fewer in total number, followed an almost indistinguishable justification structure regarding client presentation and readiness. At the group's newest acquisition, a smaller but rapidly growing house in Zurich the group had absorbed only 2 years earlier, the pattern proved considerably less pronounced, though not entirely absent, suggesting, troublingly to both Beatrix and Raphael, that the underlying culture had begun quietly propagating outward from established flagship locations like Maison Verrier rather than existing as a series of isolated, unrelated incidents. Beatrix reviewed each regional report personally as it arrived, resisting, according to Raphael's own careful account, several opportunities to intervene more aggressively or publicly before the complete picture across all 12 locations had been properly and thoroughly assembled. I want complete facts before I want consequences, she told him during one particularly late evening call reviewing the Milan findings in detail. Consequences delivered without complete facts simply become a different, equally troubling kind of unfairness, and I have no interest in replacing one injustice with another simply because it feels more immediately satisfying. Meanwhile, at Maison Verrier itself, Etienne Roquefort continued working his usual schedule, the boutique's management having made the deliberate, carefully considered decision not to suspend him prematurely while the formal review proceeded across all 12 locations, a decision Beatrix herself had specifically requested, over Margot's initial concern that it might appear, to observant staff, like a form of tacit institutional permission to continue precisely as before. I understand the concern about appearances, Beatrix had said during their lengthy conversation on the matter, but I would considerably rather this be handled correctly than handled quickly. If he is ultimately terminated, and based on what we have found so far, I suspect he will be, I want it to happen because the accumulated evidence supports that outcome clearly and thoroughly, documented and reviewed with genuine care, rather than because we panicked under the mounting pressure of industry gossip beginning to spread. It was during this careful period, roughly 2 weeks after the initial incident, that a well-regarded luxury and lifestyle journalist, someone with genuine, long-standing connections across the European jewelry industry, published a measured, carefully sourced piece in a respected international publication, describing, without initially naming the specific house involved, a broader pattern the journalist had apparently been quietly investigating across several luxury retail sectors for months, involving what she termed the quiet architecture of exclusivity, the specific, often unspoken systems by which certain luxury establishments determined, almost entirely through visual assessment, who deserved genuine attention and who did not. The piece, once published, gained considerable traction within luxury industry circles specifically because of its careful, non-sensational tone, and within days, informed readers within the jewelry world had largely connected its central anecdote, described only as a recent incident at a historic Parisian-founded house's flagship location, to Maison Verrier specifically, the details simply too precise to belong to any other establishment. Margot called Beatrix the morning the connection became widely apparent within the industry, her voice tight with renewed, considerable anxiety. "It is being discussed openly now, at least within our specific circles. I do not believe the general public has made the connection yet, but within the industry, there is no ambiguity remaining about which house this concerns. Then we should be prepared to speak honestly about it, if directly asked," Beatrix said, her tone calm despite the mounting pressure clearly building around the entire situation, not defensively, and not through the kind of careful corporate language specifically designed to minimize genuine harm. "If someone asks us directly what occurred here, we tell them the truth, and we tell them, with equal clarity, exactly what we are doing to address it across the entire group." That specific opportunity arrived roughly 10 days later, when the same journalist, having by then confirmed the connection through her own sources within the industry, published a considerably more direct follow-up piece, this time naming Maison Verrier explicitly and describing, in careful, extensively sourced detail, both the original incident and the subsequent internal audit that had, by that point, become known to enough industry insiders that Chatoyant's own communications office had little realistic choice but to respond directly rather than continue managing the story purely through private, internal channels. Beatrix, consistent with the careful approach she had outlined to Margot from the earliest days of the situation, declined every direct interview request that followed, issuing instead a single, considerably detailed written statement through the group's communications office once the full internal audit across all 12 locations had properly and thoroughly concluded, roughly 9 weeks after the original incident at Maison Verrier. "Following an extensive internal review conducted across all 12 of our boutique locations," the statement read, "Chatoyant Luxury Group has concluded that client interaction practices at several of our properties failed, in documented and significant ways, to reflect the standard of genuine hospitality and respect we hold ourselves accountable to across our entire portfolio. We have taken appropriate personnel action at the locations where this review identified clear, sustained patterns of concern, and we have implemented new, standardized client interaction protocols across all 12 boutiques, designed specifically to remove individual staff discretion from decisions regarding which clients receive full access to our flagship collections. We are genuinely grateful to the client whose experience brought this broader pattern to our attention, and we remain fully committed to ensuring every individual who walks through any of our doors, across every market we serve, receives the same considered attention and respect, regardless of what they happen to be wearing when they arrive." The statement, considerably more detailed than the group's usual careful, minimal public communications, confirmed what industry insiders had already largely pieced together across the preceding weeks, and within days, Etienne Roquefort's departure from Maison Verrier, and the parallel departure of the Milan associate whose pattern had proven nearly as troubling, became something considerably closer to acknowledged industry fact than carefully guarded private personnel matter, discussed with genuine openness within luxury retail circles across multiple countries. though the group itself never released the more granular specific details of either termination beyond the deliberately measured language of its public statement. 8 months later, Beatrix Solano walked once again through Maison Verrier's discreet, elegant entrance, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon considerably less eventful than the one that had first brought her there. The boutique's new manager, a woman named Colette Rousseau, promoted from within the associate staff specifically for her demonstrated commitment to the group's newly standardized client interaction protocols, greeted her with the same warm, unhurried professionalism she extended to every client who walked through the door, regardless of coat, boots, or the specific quality of eye contact they happened to make within their first few seconds inside the boutique. "Miss Solano, wonderful to see you again," Colette said, her tone genuinely warm rather than merely practiced. "Would you like to see the solitaire again, or perhaps something new we've recently added to the collection?" Beatrix considered this for a moment, then followed Colette toward the familiar center case, examining the piece once more beneath the boutique's soft, deliberate lighting. The room around her carried its usual hushed elegance, other clients moving quietly between cases throughout the showroom without, as far as she could observe, any particular discernible pattern beyond the simple, straightforward order in which their requests had been made. She thought, briefly, about Etienne Roquefort, and about the specific, cultivated confidence with which he had once assured her that reading a client's readiness within seconds was simply part of protecting a piece of genuine significance. She thought about the 26 documented instances, and the considerably larger, uncountable number that likely existed only in memory, in the quiet discomfort of clients who had simply accepted the secondary collection and never said a word about it, assuming, as people so often do in rooms designed specifically to intimidate, that the humiliation was theirs alone to absorb quietly rather than something genuinely worth challenging. She did not feel triumphant, exactly, standing at that familiar case once more. What she felt was closer to a kind of settled, considered clarity, the specific satisfaction of watching an entrenched system correct itself not through anger or public spectacle, but through patient, thorough documentation and a genuine, structural unwillingness to let institutional convenience continue excusing a pattern once it had been clearly and comprehensively identified across an entire organization. If you have ever been quietly redirected, dismissed, or made to feel as though the lesser case, the lesser table, or the lesser room was somehow the only one genuinely available to you, remember this: the people who make that judgment about you within the first few seconds rarely imagine the moment it might eventually come back around, and they almost never expect it to arrive as calmly, and as thoroughly documented, as it usually, eventually does. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Silent Empire for more true-to-life stories of quiet power and the moments it finally speaks up. New story every week. See you in the next one.